Hello everyone. Please tell me, which city are you listening from? What time is it there? I had been wandering downtown late in the evening, the city lights shimmering through the drizzle that had started an hour earlier. There was a soft, constant patter of rain against the pavement, the kind of gentle sound that makes the world feel quieter, slower, almost suspended in time. I wasn't in a rush. I had come out for a simple walk to clear my mind after a long day of work. The streets were familiar, almost comforting, with the occasional glow of neon signs reflecting in puddles like fractured mirrors. But something felt off, though I couldn't put my finger on it. I turned a corner near the old shopping district. Past the storefronts I had passed 1,000 times before, and that's when I noticed the first billboard. It was a digital screen above a closed cafe, the light from it flickering softly through the rain. And then I saw it, my face. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, or maybe someone had placed a poster there as a joke. But no, the image was unmistakable. My features were clear, sharp, impossibly detailed, down to the faint scar near my eyebrow that no one else knew about. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. The rain-slick pavement reflected the light, doubling the effect, but when I glanced up, it was still there. And then I noticed another one. Across the street, on the side of a clothing store, another billboard, this one larger, brighter, and again, my face. It wasn't smiling, wasn't frowning, it was neutral, calm in a way that made the skin crawl. My heart began to beat faster, a low thrum that echoed in my ears. I started walking faster, trying to convince myself this was some kind of advertising campaign, maybe a hyper-targeted joke, or a glitch in a new AI marketing system. But the deeper I went into the streets, the more billboards appeared. My face on a screen outside a movie theater, another above a restaurant, even one flickering on the side of a construction site where no advertisements had ever been before. Each image was different, a slightly different angle, a slightly different expression, but always undeniably me. I could feel the rain soaking through my coat, my hair plastered to my forehead, but I didn't notice the cold. All I could see were the screens, my own eyes staring back at me from places I had never imagined. There were no captions, no text, no brand names, just me. And yet, the images weren't still. Each flickered with subtle movements, the blink of an eye, a twitch of a lip, almost imperceptible, but enough to make it feel like I wasn't looking at a photo, I was being observed. Panic started to rise, twisting my stomach into knots. I thought about running, ducking into a side street, disappearing into the shadows. But even then, I felt eyes on me, not from people, from the billboards themselves. It was as if the images were alive, watching, waiting, mimicking my every movement in real time. I turned a corner, thinking I could escape the digital gaze, but the next block was lined with screens, all blinking my face in unison, all perfectly synchronized. I stopped, I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight, my mind spinning. Each step I tried to take forward, the screens seemed to shift, rotating subtly, as if guiding me, herding me toward something I didn't want to see. And then I noticed that it wasn't just the screens. Reflections in the glass windows of closed stores, puddles on the sidewalk, even the metallic surfaces of parked cars, all of them carried my face. My expression, my exact gaze following me wherever I turned. I sank to a bench, under the weak glow of a street lamp, drenched, shaking, trying to tell myself I was imagining it. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe some side effect of a migraine. But the screens didn't blink. They didn't fade. My face stayed there, neutral, observing, patient. And then I noticed something new, subtle differences in each image. In one, my eyes looked tired. In another, fearful. In another, almost smiling, but none of these expressions were mine. They were suggestions, glimpses of emotions I hadn't felt in years, or perhaps had never felt at all. The rain grew heavier, pounding the pavement like a heartbeat, matching the rhythm of my own frantic pulse. I wanted to scream, but my voice felt swallowed by the wet, empty streets. The city seemed too large, too quiet, yet every corner, every screen, every shadow held me in place. And then, almost imperceptibly, the billboards began to change. My neutral face dissolved into new images' faces that looked like mine but weren't. Shadows of me stitched together in ways that made my stomach turn. A ghostly version of myself winked from one billboard. Another stretched its mouth impossibly wide. Another blinked too slowly, as if it had never learned how to close its eyes properly. I realized then that I was standing in the middle of an endless gallery of me, every screen, every reflection, every flicker in the rain, a version of myself I didn't recognize. The city was alive with it, and somehow, I was the only one who could see it. There were no passers-by, no taxis, no distant chatters, just the rain and the faces, waiting, whispering in a language I didn't understand, but felt in the marrow of my bones. Hours or maybe minutes passed. Time itself seemed to stretch, unnaturally tied to the pulse of the neon lights. I tried to walk, tried to leave, but every street led me back to the same square, the same block, the same screens staring at me. It was as if the city itself had folded around me, reshaping to contain me, to make me witness. Eventually, I sat down on the wet pavement, head in my hands, exhausted and drenched. The screens flickered, casting ghostly light across the puddles. And I thought I saw one version of my face wink knowingly, almost human, almost cruel. The rain continued its soft, relentless rhythm. I couldn't move, I couldn't leave, and I realized, with the sinking, terrible certainty, that the city didn't just show me my face. It knew me, in ways I had never admitted even to myself. And it was patient. It was waiting. Even now, after I somehow stumbled home, drenched and trembling, I can't stop seeing them. My face in reflections, in screens, in shadows. A subtle flicker at the corner of my eye, a whisper of movement where nothing exists. And I know, deep down, that one day I'll return to that city, or perhaps it will return to Meond. When that happens, the billboards will be waiting, and this time, they won't just be watching. I had been walking home later than usual that night, the streets slick with rain, neon signs shimmering in puddles like fractured mirrors. There was a silence in the city that always unsettled me, the quiet between the rush hours, when the usual hum of traffic and chatter of passers-by seemed to vanish entirely, leaving only the distant hiss of water running along gutters. I walked slowly, letting the rhythm of the rain on my coat and the pavement guide me, feeling a strange calm settle over my senses. When I reached the intersection near the old library, I saw her. she appeared from the far side of the street, walking casually as though the world around her held no sway over her steps. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual until I realized that the cars, lined up at the red lights, had stopped mid-motion, engines humming faintly but entirely still, suspended in time, tires pressed against wet asphalt without turning, headlights frozen in their glow, the drivers visible but completely rigid, as though the city had paused, folding around her in silent obedience. My chest tightened. I tried to look away, telling myself it was impossible, that I must be seeing some trick of the reflections or the lights in the rain. But I couldn't. Every instinct in me demanded that I keep watching, and every instinct whispered that what I was witnessing was not meant to be understood. She moved with an almost deliberate ease, her steps light yet unwavering. Water splashed around her shoes as she crossed, but no car shifted, no horn blared, no tire screeched. Even the shadows cast by the streetlights seemed to bend around her, following her without distortion. I felt a cold prickle along the back of my neck, a slow tightening in my stomach, as if my own body had been left behind while my senses were dragged forward into some other plane of perception. I took a hesitant step onto the sidewalk, closer, and the world felt surreal. The sounds of the city, the distant rumble of a train, the faint music from a nearby cafe continued as if nothing had happened. Yet here, in the intersection, reality itself had fractured. She reached the far side, paused, and turned her head in my direction, though her eyes didn't meet mine. They stared past me, beyond me, towards something I couldn't see. The air seemed heavier around her, a subtle vibration in the rain-soaked night that I felt in my bones rather than my ears. I wanted to speak, to call out, but my voice refused. My limbs were slow, heavy, and unresponsive, though I was moving. It was like swimming through a liquid gravity that only existed around her path. And then, almost imperceptibly, the first car in the frozen line shifted its engine, coughs braking. The stillness, but it was as if it had resumed motion only reluctantly, bending to some unseen rule that she dictated. By the time the last vehicle moved, she had vanished from my sight, the shadows swallowing her like she had never been there at all. I lingered at the intersection for a long time after, rain soaking through my jacket, watching the normalcy return piece by piece. The streetlights flickered, the cars began to roll naturally, and the distant sounds of the city crept back in, reclaiming the night. But the memory of her steps remained vivid, impossibly precise, impossibly calm, like a mark left on the world itself. I kept expecting to see her again, around a corner, across another street, or in some reflection in the rain. But the city seemed to have folded back into its ordinary rhythm, hiding whatever it had shown me. I never knew who she was. I never saw her again. Yet every time I cross an intersection late at night, when the streets are quiet and the rain is falling, I feel the pull of that impossible stillness. The memory of a world that paused just for her. And I wonder how many times has the city done this before, and how many times will it do it again, with someone else, somewhere else, unseen, bending reality without a sound. I've never been someone who easily startled. I've always found comfort in the ordinary, the predictable rhythm of daily life, the quiet hum of familiar streets, and the steady pulse of my own heartbeats. But there's a night I keep returning to, in my mind, not out of nostalgia or curiosity, but because it changed the way I perceive time, space, and the delicate thread that separates reality from something else entirely. I can still feel the rain, even now, tapping endlessly against the windows of that little flat I rented for the weekend in the outskirts of the town. It was the kind of rain that never fully stopped, as though the clouds had conspired to keep the world submerged in a gray, unbroken curtain. I remember it began in the early evening light at first, whispering against the eaves, turning the streets into reflective ribbons of silver and shadow. I had arrived late, just as the last bus rattled down the uneven cobblestone lanes. The town was older than memory, and though the streets were empty, there was a strange familiarity in the way the lamplights flickered, almost as if they recognized me, or perhaps as if they were warning me. My flat overlooked a small square, dominated by a clock tower. It was a magnificent structure, tall and austere, its stonework carved with faded, intricate details that the years had softened into gentle curves and jagged edges. I first noticed it because of the way the rain pooled at its base, reflecting its face in the dark water, distorting the hands and the numerals until they seemed fluid, alive, almost breathing. The first night was ordinary. I unpacked slowly, listening to the rain, savoring the quiet solitude. I poured myself a cup of tea, and the warmth seemed to seep into my bones, pushing the chill out of my fingers and toes. I could see the clock face through the window. At 10 minutes to midnight, the hands aligned perfectly, and I watched them in a kind of trance. There was something hypnotic about the pendulum-like sweep of the minute hand, the slow inevitability of time marching forward, and I felt my mind begin to soften around its edges. Then, at precisely midnight, it struck. One chime, long and sonorous, vibrating in the air with a resonance that seemed older than the town itself. I had expected 12, of course, for the hour, but after the 12th strike, there came a 13th. A pause, a silence that stretched a second too long, and then another chime. It reverberated in my chest, not in the ears, and for a moment, I froze, staring at the darkened tower. There was no one on the streets, no wind to account for the way the sound lingered, lingering and pulsing like a heartbeat not entirely my own. I tried to dismiss it. Perhaps I had missed her. Perhaps the tower's old mechanics were failing, a gear slipping in the dark. I shook my head and returned to my tea, but the sound, the unnatural resonance, had already settled into my awareness. It was a sound that seemed to carry intention, as though the chime itself was aware that someone was listening, that someone had been foolish enough to notice. Sleep did not come easily. Every time my eyes closed, I imagined the face of the clock, its numerals twisting in subtle, impossible ways. Shadows moved where they should not, curling around the edges of the room, soft, undulating, but never fully materializing. Sometimes I could hear whispers. Not voices, exactly, but the kind of indistinct murmurs that might be carried by the rain itself. I told myself it was the wind through the gaps in the old windows, but the whispers grew more persistent with each passing hour, rising from a murmur to something almost articulate, though no words ever formed. The next day, I tried to distract myself. I walked the streets, passing shuttered shops and abandoned benches slick with rain. The town was quiet, but it felt wrong too quiet, as though it were holding its breath. People did exist, glimpses. of them through curtained windows, or the silhouette of a figure slipping past a doorway, but no one approached, and the clock tower followed me. Its shadow stretched longer than it should, bending over the streets in ways that didn't match the position of the sun. I told myself it was an optical illusion, a trick of light and water, but the unease had taken root, and I could not shake it. Night came again, and with it, the rain. This time, I watched the clock with a growing dread. When midnight struck, the first 12 chimes were as expected, measured, and deliberate. But the 13th came. Again, louder now, more insistent, and it carried with it a vibration that seemed to hum through the floorboards, through my bones. And then, for the first time, I saw it, or rather, I felt its presence, a shadow on the tower's face that should not have been there. It was a figure, tall and thin, impossibly still, staring down at me from the pinnacle, yet the tower's height should have obscured any detail. Its face was hidden, but I felt its gaze like a weight pressing against my chest. I blinked, and it was gone, but the imprint lingered, a cold ache that would not leave. I tried reasoning again. Perhaps I had been reading too many stories, letting my imagination color the quiet moments with terror. Yet, even in the daylight, the tower felt different, somehow closer. My reflection in the rain-slicked streets sometimes seemed delayed, a fraction of a second behind my movement, as if something was learning the rhythm of my actions. Small things began to disturb me. A window opening on its own, the faint scrape of footsteps that matched no pattern I could trace, the occasional scent of something metallic, almost coppery, lingering in the air. On the third night, I could not resist watching. I sat by the window, wrapped in a blanket, letting the rain mask the tension in the room. The clock struck midnight, 12 times, predictable, reassuring. Then, the 13th, and then another sound, faint, almost inaudible. Beneath the rain, the softest of knocks, coming from somewhere inside the flat. I froze, breath caught in my throat. The knocking was deliberate, methodical, slow, almost mimicking the chime. I did not move. It stopped, and then I heard the faintest whisper, my name. I could not tell whether it came from inside the room, or from the rain outside, the shadows in the corner, or from some fold of time itself. My mind, normally so calm, teetered on the edge of panic. I did not move, did not speak. The whisper dissolved into the patter of rain, and the flap was still once more. But I felt the presence lingering, an invisible weight perched just beyond the corner of my awareness. The following days passed in a blur. I left the flat briefly, walking through the town in daylight, trying to convince myself it was my imagination. The clock tower, however, remained the same. Its shadow moved against logic, stretching unnaturally, and I began to notice the 13th chime in my dreams. Even when I was miles away, it became a rhythm in my mind, a subtle undercurrent of unease, and my reflection, delayed or altered, continued to haunt me. On the final night of my stay, I sat in the dim room, rain drumming steadily against the glass. The clock ticked toward midnight. I could hear the whisper before it came, soft and distant, a warning that should have made me leave, should have made me look away. Midnight arrived, 12 chimes, and then the 13th. The vibration was stronger now, resonating through the floor, through the walls, through me. And I saw it again, the figure on the tower, taller than the structure should allow, impossibly still, watching, waiting. But this time, it moved. Just a fraction, enough to tilt its head, as though acknowledging me. And then the rain seemed to thicken, each drop heavier, and the world blurred. I blinked, and I was no longer alone. I left the flat at first light, carrying my belongings without a backward glance. The town faded behind the veil of rain, the clock tower receding until it was just a memory of stone and shadow. Yet, even now, I hear it sometimes. In the quiet moments, in the rhythm of my own heartbeat, in the faraway toll of some distant bell, I hear the 13th chime, and I wonder if I ever really left that town, or if some part of me remains, waiting for the next midnight when the clock strikes 13. I have never told anyone this story, and perhaps that is for the best. Some memories, once stirred, do not settle. They linger in the corners of the mind, in the spaces between rain and shadow, between reality and whatever else waits just beyond the reach of the ordinary. I keep my windows closed now, my nights quiet, but sometimes, in the rain, I swear I hear it, the slow, deliberate 13th chime, and a shadow that bends just slightly too far, and I wonder if, somewhere, the clock is still waiting for me. It was the kind of day when the sunlight struggled to break through the clouds, painting the streets with a dull, washed-out gray that made everything feel muted, unreal. I had been wandering the older part of town, the side streets where tourists rarely ventured, drawn by some aimless curiosity I couldn't explain. The rain had started again, light at first, the kind that smells faintly of earth and dust before turning into the relentless drumming downpour that seems intent on keeping the world locked in a quiet, wet confinement. I had passed narrow alleys and shuttered shops, the kind of places that looked as if they had been forgotten by time itself. That's when I saw an unremarkable storefront tucked between a dry cleaner and a pawn shop, its windows darkened with heavy velvet curtains that had long since faded. The sign above the door was simple, almost stark: coffins. Just that. No flourish, no promises. Just the word, in black lettering, on a yellowed wooden plaque that swung gently with the wind. Curiosity, as it often does, drew me forward. I pushed the door open, and it creaked like the exhale of a long-forgotten house. Inside, the air smelled of polished wood, cedar and pine, faintly sweet, and something darker I could not place. The store was narrow and dimly lit, a single bare bulb flickering overhead, throwing shadows across row after row of coffins. They were of all shapes and sizes, some simple and unadorned, some carved with intricate patterns, some with glossy black lacquer that reflected the dim light in faint glimmers. And then I saw it. My name. It was carved into a small, simple coffin, lying near the center of the store. The letters were neat, precise, familiar, impossibly familiar, and the sight of it made my stomach lurch. I walked toward it, each step on the creaking wooden floor loud in the stillness, and when I bent closer, I could see that the finish was flawless. The wood cool and smooth under my fingers. The air around it seemed to thrum, as if the room itself were aware that I had noticed it. I spun around, half expecting someone to be standing behind me, some shopkeeper with a smile that would explain everything away. But the store was empty. Not a single soul stirred, and yet the faintest whisper brushed past my ears, so soft I couldn't tell if it had come from the shadows or from inside my own head. It was just a breath, a sigh, a barely there sound, but it carried weight. I stepped back, telling myself it was a prank, some elaborate joke, or perhaps I had imagined it. Some trick of light and expectation. And yet, the coffin remained, perfectly inscribed, impossibly precise. I walked further down the narrow aisle, and that's when I noticed the other coffins, rows of them, each carved with a name I didn't recognize, yet some of them felt familiar. In an instinctive way, like names I might have heard in passing, whispered in the wind or in dreams. A faint tapping began somewhere behind me. I froze, listening. It was slow, deliberate, almost like fingernails running across the wood of the wall, and though it was distant, it echoed through the store with uncanny clarity. I turned toward the sound, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a figure between the shadows, tall, still, indistinct, watching. But when I blinked, it was gone, and the tapping stopped. Only the rain outside remained, drumming steadily against the windows. I approached the coffin with my name again, this time trying to convince myself I was being ridiculous. It was wood, a container, a carved object. Yet, something about it felt personal, in a way that made my skin crawl. I felt the urge to open it, to see what might be inside, and the moment I touched the lid, a shiver ran down my spine. The wood was icy, impossibly cold, and for an instant I could swear I felt it pulse, like a heartbeat slow and deliberate beneath my fingers. I recoiled, stepping back into the dim aisle. The shadows seemed to deepen then, pooling into corners that had been empty moments before. I could hear the softest of footsteps now, careful, deliberate, moving just beyond my vision. They never came closer, never approached, but the rhythm was steady, patient, as if marking time. And all the while, the coffin with my name remained at the center, watching. Hours, or maybe minutes, I could no longer tell, passed in that way when time seems to stretch and bend. The rain outside became a low, constant hum. The flickering bulb overhead cast long, wavering shadows, and I could swear that in those shadows, shapes moved, brushing past the edges of my vision. I tried to focus, tried to ground myself, but my pulse was loud in my ears, and the whispers started again, just beyond comprehension. Soft syllables I could almost but not quite recognize. I do not remember leaving. One moment I was standing there, paralyzed, staring at the coffin, and the next I was outside, under the gray drizzle. My coat soaked, the chill biting through me. The store was gone when I turned to look back. New velvet curtains, no narrow aisle of polished wood. Just an empty brick wall, unremarkable, as if the place had never existed. I told myself it was a dream, some trick of exhaustion and the low, steady rain. But when I returned home that night, lying in bed, I could not shake the feeling that someone or something had followed me. In the corner of my room, when the lights were off, I thought I saw the faintest outline of a coffin, perfectly carved, perfectly still, and the whisper, almost imperceptible, called my name. Since that day, I have avoided that part of town. I no longer wander aimlessly in the rain, and yet, in my dreams, I return to that store. The rows of coffins stretch infinitely, names carved with quiet precision, the shadows moving just beyond reach. My name remains there, always there, and the thought lingers, quiet and insistent. That coffin waits, patient, for the moment I step, to close again. And sometimes, when the rain hits my window at night, soft and steady, I wonder if it's not rain at all but the tapping of wood. The slow, deliberate rhythm of that store, calling me back to the aisle where my name waits. In silence. I had always liked walking at night, especially when the world was muted by rain. There's something about wet streets, reflective puddles, and the low hum of falling water that makes everything feel distant, almost suspended outside of time. That evening, the clouds had rolled in early, thick and gray, blotting out the moon and the stars. I had found myself drawn to the old bridge at the edge of town, a long, narrow structure of rusting metal and slick wooden planks, stretching over a river that looked black under the dim light of the street lamps. I remember the first drops hitting my coat as I stepped onto the bridge, the cold rain soaking through my jacket almost immediately. The wood beneath my boots creaked and groaned in a rhythm that matched the pulse of my own heartbeat. The town behind me disappeared into mist and shadows, leaving only the sound of water rushing beneath, the wind tugging at my hair, and the gentle, persistent patter of rain on metal and wood. I felt alive in that isolation, suspended between the familiar and the unknown. And then I noticed her. At first it was just a shape, a shadow at the far end of the bridge. She wore a long coat, dark and dripping with rain, and her hair hung heavy across her face. I assumed she was another late-night walker, perhaps lost, perhaps wandering aimlessly as I had. But there was something wrong. Her movements were too smooth, too quiet. The wooden planks didn't creak under her weight. There was no splash when she stepped over the puddles. It was as if she floated just above the surface, her presence hovering lightly, almost impossibly, over the rain-soaked bridge. I tried to dismiss it. Maybe it was a trick of the mist, a reflection in the puddles, or a shadow cast by the weak lamps. But as I moved forward, she moved too, keeping the same distance behind me, never gaining, never falling back. I turned, my head quickly, just enough to glimpse her, and my breath caught. Her face was pale, almost luminous in the dim light, but her features were blurred, as if the rain or fog refused to settle on them. She tilted her head, and though her eyes were hidden, I felt them on me, patient, expectant, and unblinking. The bridge stretched long and narrow, and I could see nothing but darkness at the far end. I quickened my pace, each step a loud, solitary echo, and yet the sound of her movement was entirely absent. No creak of wood, no splash of water, nothing. The closer I walked to the middle, the more I felt it. A pressure in the air, subtle at first, a shift in the wind, the faintest tug at the edges of my awareness. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting. I told myself to stop looking back. Focus on the boards beneath my boots. Focus on the river. Focus on anything but the shape behind me. And yet, in the corner of my vision, she was always there, gliding, impossibly still, her coat brushing nothing, her feet never quite touching. Sometimes, I thought I saw a shimmer, like heat over asphalt, around the tips of her shoes. The faintest disturbance of air, as though she existed in a place just slightly removed from the physical. The rain intensified, hammering down in a steady rhythm, drowning out all other sound. And still, I felt her, patient, relentless, a presence that matched the beat of my pulse. I tried to call out, to demand she speak, but my voice seemed swallowed by the storm, the words vanishing before they reached the air. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs, an urgent, desperate drumbeat that seemed loud enough to echo across the river. Then came the whispers. So soft, so faint, I thought at first it was the wind, the river, the rain. But the more I walked, the clearer they became. Not words exactly, more like a melody of syllables, tones that grazed the edge of understanding, brushing against memories I didn't recognize. Sometimes, I thought I caught my own name, whispered in fragments, as though carried by someone standing just behind me. But when I looked, she remained silent, unmoving, gliding over the bridge as though the laws of gravity refused to touch. Her panic started to creep in. My steps faltered. The bridge seemed longer than it should have been, stretching endlessly into the mist. Shadows thickened around me, and every time I thought I could make out the end of it, the fog swallowed it whole. I tried running, but my boots slipped on the slick wood, and still she kept pace. Not faster, not slower, just perfectly aligned with me, as if tethered to my very presence. At some point, I stumbled and fell onto the wet boards, the cold water seeping through my clothes, numbing my limbs. I dared a glance behind me, and there she was, gliding closer, impossibly, silently, her head tilted slightly, watching, and then I noticed it. A faint reflection in the puddles beside me. She cast no reflection. The rain distorted everything. Else the bridge, the sky, my own trembling form, but her image never appeared in the water. She existed only above it, hovering, waiting. I scrambled to my feet and ran, letting the rhythm of the boards beneath me carry me forward. My lungs burned, my vision blurred with rain and fear, but the sense of her never left me. The whispers grew louder, sharper, teasing the edge of comprehension. I could hear faint laughter too, delicate, hollow, like a wind chime trembling in the storm, brushing my ears, circling around me. And I knew, somewhere in the fog, she was always there, moving in tandem, keeping perfect step without ever stepping at all. Finally, I reached the far side of the bridge, gasping, soaked, my coat plastered to my skin. I dared to look back once more. The mist had swallowed her again. The bridge was empty, silent except for the rain. My relief was fragile, a tremor in my chest, because I knew, somewhere, she had not truly disappeared. Something in the air told me she had only paused, waiting for the next time I wandered too far, too late, too alone. I never crossed that bridge again. Not at night, not in daylight, not even in memory. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, when the rain taps softly against my window, I see her gliding above the boards, silent, patient, waiting, and I feel the pull of her presence, gentle but unyielding, like the bridge itself reaching for me, reminding me that some things are not meant to touch the ground and some things never let you go. Even now, years later, when the rain begins, I can feel the hum of her passage, a weightless echo following me across streets, sidewalks, and alleyways. I know she is still there, gliding above the world, tethered to me by some invisible thread. Watching, waiting, her presence a subtle vibration against the skin of reality. I had never seen the city like that before. It started as a flicker, a tiny interruption in the steady glow of the skyline. The kind you almost dismiss as a power surge or a bulb burning out. But within minutes, every street lamp, neon sign, and office window went dark, plunging the city into a heavy, unnatural quiet. The hum of electricity that usually buzzed beneath the streets vanished, leaving nothing but the soft patter of rain on asphalt and the distant sigh of wind curling through alleyways. I stood on my balcony, gripping the railing, trying to make sense of it. The darkness was thick, almost tactile, pressing in from all sides, yet strangely, I could still see, not in the sense of moonlight or reflections, for there were no lights, no stars, no glow at all. It was as if my eyes had adjusted to a realm beyond ordinary sight, able to perceive shapes, textures, and movements with a clarity that made the blackness seem alive. I could see the rain falling in mid-air, droplets hanging like suspended jewels, each one tracing a path in slow motion, as if time itself had softened. The streets below were empty, not a single car or pedestrian moving, yet I could feel life in the shadows. Shapes flickered along the edges of vision, barely perceptible, darting and gliding like smoke curling against the wind. I could see the outline of a man crossing the street in a suit that looked wet, but when I squinted closer, I realized his movements were wrong, too precise, too fluid, as though he were not bound by gravity or the rhythm of ordinary walking. His head tilted unnaturally, his arms hanging loosely, and still he moved forward, slow and deliberate, without ever touching the pavement fully. A chill crawled up my spine. I wanted to look away, to close my eyes and escape the clarity of the darkness, but my vision refused to obey. Even as I turned, I could see the wet bricks of nearby buildings, the warped reflections in puddles, the glimmer of broken glass that littered abandoned sidewalks. Every detail was vivid, painfully clear, and yet completely silent. No hum of the city, no footfalls, no distant sirens, just the rain and the shapes that moved in the shadows. I stepped down from the balcony, the hallway carpet cool beneath my bare feet, and made my way toward the street. The air smelled sharp, metallic, like rain on steel and concrete. But under it was something else, something faintly sweet, almost like decay. My steps echoed in my apartment, then outside on the wet pavement, though no one else was there, and yet I could feel them. Shapes drifting just beyond the periphery, shadows that didn't belong to any object, and a whispering that wasn't quite audible. The sounds brushed against my ears, a static of half-formed words and murmurs I couldn't understand. I walked further, drawn by a mixture of fear and fascination. A car sat in the middle of the street, headlights dead, hood glistening with rain, yet I could see the faintest outline of a driver inside. He moved his hands along the steering wheel in patterns that made no sense, gestures slow and deliberate, and when he turned his head toward me, his eyes were dark voids, hollow and deep, yet somehow aware of me. I wanted to run, but my feet carried me forward, drawn along by a gravity I didn't understand. The buildings around me seemed to warp as I moved. Windows reflected shapes that didn't exist. Stairwells led to nothing, and doorways appeared where there should be walls. Every shadow seemed to breathe, to shift, to curl toward me, and I felt the softest brush of wind at the back of my neck, carrying with it faint fragments of laughter, children, women, men, all distorted, unplaceable, as though the city itself had taken a voice and was whispering secrets just beyond comprehension. I reached the river that sliced through the city like a black vein. The water was perfectly still, unnaturally so, reflecting nothing of the sky or the buildings, yet I could see beneath its surface shapes, moving just out of reach, dark forms weaving through the currents with unnatural grace. I saw my own reflection, pale and wide-eyed, and it didn't blink when I did. Something shifted behind me, a movement in the corner of my vision, and when I turned, there was nothing there but still. I felt watched, felt the steady, patient gaze of a presence that followed every step. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. I could no longer tell. Time had dissolved in the black clarity of the night. Rain fell steadily, the only sound, yet the city was alive with subtle motion. Lights could be gone, but sight alone was no barrier. I could see every shadow, every puddle, every floating piece of debris with painful, perfect sharpness. And through it all, the shapes lingered, watchers on rooftops, figures in windows, shadows that stretched and recoiled as I passed. None of them fully formed, all of them aware. Eventually, exhaustion pulled at me. I returned to my apartment, hoping that the warmth, the walls, the door locked behind me, would shelter me from whatever lingered outside. But in the darkness of my room, I could still see. The familiar shapes of my furniture were there, yes, but between them, other shapes now moved with ease. Silent, patient, observing. I could see the rain dripping along the edges of my window, and the street below, and in the reflection of the glass, I could see dozens of faces pressed just behind mine, fleeting and impossible, their eyes endless, unblinking. I have not slept well since that night. Every time the lights go out, even for a flicker, even for a brief moment, I can see. Not in the literal sense, not like vision guided by light, but something else entirely. I can see the world in the absence of illumination, see the things that linger just beyond perception, see what lives in the spaces the light refuses to touch. And I have learned to fear the clarity of darkness more than blindness itself. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I step to the window, and the city lights have returned, warm and mundane, but I know they hide nothing. Behind them, beneath the surface, beyond the glow, the watchers remain. The shapes drift, the shadows breathe, and in the quiet, I know. Even when the lights are back, I am still seeing everything. It was a damp afternoon when I wandered through the old part of town, the kind of neighborhood that seemed to exist only in memory. The streets were narrow, lined with cracked sidewalks and buildings with peeling paint, the air heavy with the scent of rain-soaked earth and something faintly metallic. I had come here on a whim, seeking the comfort of quiet, away from the constant hum of the city's newer districts. The rain had been steady all day, leaving pools in the uneven pavement that reflected the skeletal outlines of skeletal trees and rusted street lamps. I walked slowly, boots splashing in shallow puddles, listening to the steady tap of rain against my hood. That's when I saw it. A stretch of sidewalk, freshly paved door, so it seemed with cement still damp in certain patches. I slowed my pace, curious despite myself. The surface shimmered under the gray light, streaked with rain, almost inviting touch, and then I noticed the letters. At first, I thought it must be a coincidence, a random scratch someone had made, but as I approached, my breath caught in my throat. The letters were clear, deliberate, and precise. They spelled my name, each letter perfectly formed, pressed into the wet cement with care, as if someone had been waiting for me to find it. My hands trembled, not from cold, not entirely from fear, but from the sheer impossibility of it. I had never seen this part of town, never walked these streets as a child, and yet here, on a slab of cement that had to be decades old, was my name. I crouched down, careful not to touch it. The rain was beginning to pool around the edges, darkening the concrete, and yet the impression of the letters remained crisp, as if untouched by time or weather. I ran my fingers along the grooves, and the chill of the wet cement seeped into my skin. It was impossible. I knew that cement dried quickly, hardened and cracked over weeks, months, years. But this looked like it had been pressed in yesterday, though the surrounding cracks and wear suggested it had been there for decades. A sudden shiver ran down my spine as I looked closer. There were more markings, tiny, almost imperceptible scratches beneath the letters, like fingerprints pressed into the surface. They traced the contours of the letters, small arcs and ridges that suggested deliberate shaping, but also something else. There was a rhythm to them, a repetition, almost like a heartbeat frozen in stone. And I could feel it, something in the air that wasn't wind, something subtle, like a presence hovering just beyond sight. I stood up abruptly, rain sliding down my hood, and surveyed the block. The street was empty, the buildings silent, yet I could feel eyes on me, not human eyes, not the eyes of passers-by, but something ancient, patient, waiting. The street behind me seemed to stretch farther than it should have, shadows pooling in impossible shapes around the curbs, puddles reflecting figures that didn't belong to any object. I turned back to the cement, and the letters of my name seemed sharper, darker, more pronounced, as if they had been waiting for me all this time. Memories I didn't have rose to the surface, disjointed and fleeting. A small child pressing their hands into wet cement, a shadowed figure watching from across the street, a whisper of my name carried on a wind that had long since ceased. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it as imagination, as my mind seeking patterns where there were none. But the more I looked, the more impossible it became to deny. Every crack in the surrounding pavement seemed to point toward the letters, guiding the eye, directing attention. My name, centered in the middle of everything, like a beacon. I wanted to leave. I wanted to turn my back, walk away, and never think of it again. But something kept me rooted. A faint echo of footsteps behind me, soft and deliberate, mirrored my own steps. I didn't dare turn. I could feel the gaze on me intensifying, a pressure against my chest that made each breath shallow. I could almost hear a soft scratching, as if someone or something was adding to the cement even now, reshaping it to suit a memory that was not mine. Hours, or maybe minutes, passed as I stood there. The rain intensified, drumming on the sidewalk, running in rivulets over the letters of my name. And yet, the more it rained, the more distinct the impressions became. I could see faint traces of other words, blurred, incomplete, as if someone had started writing, paused, and left them unfinished. They were familiar in ways that unsettled me, shapes that echoed syllables I could almost remember, sounds that my mind couldn't place, but that it recognized. Finally, with a shiver of dread and fascination, I forced myself to step back. I tried to shake the feeling of being watched, tried to convince myself that this was some prank, some forgotten memorial of a child I didn't know, a coincidence that had no meaning. And yet, the sensation followed me as I walked, dripping wet along the empty streets, shadows seeming to tilt toward me with every step, reflections in the puddles glimmering with forms that didn't belong. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the letters pressed into wet cement, sharp and unyielding. I saw the scratches beneath them, traced by fingers I could not see, shaping my name in a rhythm I could not comprehend. And I could feel it something waiting for me, patient and eternal, not bound by time or space. A presence tethered to those letters, tethered to me, existing in the shadow between memory and reality. In the days that followed, I returned to that street, hoping for clarity, for answers, but the sidewalk was cracked and dry, worn smooth by years and foot traffic. My name was gone, as though it had never been there, leaving only the faintest traces of impossible shapes beneath the surface. And yet, when the rain falls now, I can see them, just barely, glowing faintly beneath the puddles, as if pressed into the world in a time I cannot measure. Sometimes, late at night, I walk past that old block, and I swear I can hear the faintest scratching, soft and deliberate, beneath my feet, shaping something in the wet cement of memory, waiting for me to remember, waiting for me to return. And I know, in the quietest part of my mind, that I never truly left it behind. I first noticed her on a night that had begun like any other, with the soft, persistent drizzle that seemed to blur the edges of the city. The streetlights cast halos in the fog, puddles reflecting their dim glow, and the world felt quiet, almost withdrawn. I was walking home from the late shift, my umbrella heavy with water, boots splashing in shallow puddles, when I saw her. She was in the middle of the street, spinning slowly, her movements deliberate, like she was listening to a song only she could hear. Her dress, long and dark, clung to her body in the rain, flowing outward as she twirled. At first, I thought she might be lost or drunk, something ordinary. But there was no stumbling, no imbalance, no hint of awareness that anyone else was around. She danced with perfect grace, her feet gliding over wet asphalt as if it were a stage. And every so often, she looked up at the empty windows and tilted her head, smiling faintly, not at me, but through me, as though she could see something beyond the physical world. I slowed, instinctively keeping a distance. The street was deserted, the usual hum of traffic absent, leaving only the soft sound of rain and the occasional drip from sagging eaves. No car honked, no driver shouted, no one came to intervene. It was as if the world had agreed to step aside, to let her move, uninterrupted. My heartbeat quickened not, out of fear at first, but out of the oddity of it. People do not simply dance in the middle of streets, not with traffic and city life surrounding them. And yet, the more I watched, the more I began to notice details that unsettled me. Her movements were smooth but impossibly precise, almost mechanical. She spun without getting dizzy, her hair trailing behind her like liquid silk, untouched by the wind that rustled the leaves along the sidewalk. The puddles beneath her feet did not ripple as she moved. No water shifted, no sound came from the street itself. It was as though she floated slightly above the ground, each step perfectly silent. I considered leaving, but something rooted me in place. There was a familiarity in the way she moved, something I could not place. And then I noticed her eyes. Even from across the street, even in the dim, blurred light of the rain, I could see that they were not quite right. Too large, too reflective. And in them flickered glimpses of other streets, other nights, other moments that I had never lived. They held a weight, a patient knowing that made my chest tighten. I walked a little closer, trying to convince myself I was imagining it. The wet asphalt squeaked softly under my boots, breaking the surreal silence in tiny echoes. She paused mid-twirl, raising her arms above her head, and I could swear she tilted her head toward me, as though she had always known I would come this far. For a brief moment, the world seemed to bend around her. The streetlights glimmered. Puddles reflected her image countless times, and the rain seemed to slow, hanging in the air like suspended droplets. I tried to speak, to call out, but my voice was swallowed by the rain. No words emerged. And yet, I felt her hear me, felt a ripple pass through the air that reached me like a soft exhale. She began moving again, each turn more intricate, almost choreographed. Her shadow stretched unnaturally across the street, doubling and splitting, twisting into angles that defied the geometry of the buildings. And still, the street remained empty, no honking, no footsteps, no other life. Time became strange. I do not know how long I stood there, minutes, hours, perhaps only seconds, but the rain never stopped. I noticed details I should have ignored. The flickering street lamp that never fully went out, the broken sign swaying with no wind, a cat sitting on a fence that never moved, watching her as if it had been waiting all night, and she danced on, oblivious or indifferent to me, to the world, to everything. Something compelled me to follow her. I stepped forward cautiously, and she shifted ever so slightly, leading me down narrow alleys, past storefronts with shutters closed long ago, over puddles that reflected more than the rain shapes, faces, fragments of memories I could not place. Each time I blinked, the world seemed to shift. The familiar streets I knew so well became distorted, elongated, like I had stepped into a mirror city, a version of reality that existed just out of reach. She never looked back, never spoke, and never acknowledged my presence directly. And yet, I could feel her awareness, like a tether stretched between us. The further I followed, the more I realized the unsettling truth. I had seen her before, or at least someone like her, in old photographs, in fleeting glimpses in the corner of my eye, in dreams that I had dismissed as imagination. And now, here she was, moving through the city as though it were her private stage, orchestrating the night with movements that were impossible, hypnotic, and quietly menacing. The rain began to fall harder, drumming against my umbrella, soaking through my coat, making the air heavy with mist. Her dance continued, unaffected by the elements, unaffected by gravity, by logic, by time itself. Shadows converged in the corners of the street, twisting into shapes that seemed to watch, to wait, and yet she did not falter. I wanted to call for help, to grab my phone, to prove to myself that this was real, that I was not losing my mind, but every step I took, every action I attempted, felt inconsequential, irrelevant. She was the axis around which this night revolved. Finally, she stopped, abruptly, in the center of an intersection I had known since childhood. The puddles beneath her rippled faintly, reflecting her figure in a dozen fractured fragments. She raised her arms slowly, deliberately, and looked up toward the sky, the clouds reflecting in her wide, unblinking eyes. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she vanished. Not into shadows, not into mist, but into nothing at all. The street was empty, quiet, mundane. The rain fell normally. The city lights flickered back to life. I stood there for a long time, soaked to the bone, heart racing, staring at the intersection where she had danced. No trace remained, no footprints, no puddles disturbed, nothing to indicate she had ever been there. And yet, I could still feel, the memory, the weight of her presence, the lingering brush of impossibility against the edges of the world. I know that night did not truly end, that she had left something behind, not in the street, not in the city, but in me. Even now, when the rain falls and I walk home late, I glance at the streets, the intersections, the puddles, half expecting to see her return. And sometimes, when I catch movement in the corner of my vision, I swear I see her there gliding, spinning, dancing in the middle of the street, and I remember that no one ever stopped her. It began on an evening that felt unusually quiet for the city. The rain had been falling steadily all day, a persistent drizzle that left the streets slick and the air heavy with the scent of wet asphalt and iron. I had stopped by the ATM near the corner of my neighborhood, the one I usually avoided because it felt dim and forgotten, tucked between a shuttered cafe and a small electronics store. There was something comforting in its anonymity, a place where no one looked too closely, where transactions happened in quiet privacy. I approached, shaking the rain off my coat, and inserted my card. The screen blinked softly, the familiar prompts guiding me to select the amount. I punched in the numbers, expecting the usual series of beeps and clicks. But what came out of the slot next made me freeze. The ATM spat out a stack of bills, each one slipping slowly into my hand. At first I thought it was a strange printing error, but as I fanned them out, my heart stopped. There, staring back at me from each bill, was my face. My eyes pale in the greenish tint of the currency, my features rendered in sharp, almost photographic detail. I dropped the bills, but the machine continued to produce more, each one identical. Every note, a perfect replica of my own face. I stumbled backward, the wet tiles beneath my feet threatening to betray me as I backed into the dim light. The rain outside seemed to intensify, drumming harder on the metal awning above, masking the small, mechanical clatter of the ATM. I stared, paralyzed, as the stack grew larger, spilling onto the ground, curling slightly from the damp. There was something wrong, not just the impossibility of seeing myself printed on currency, but the way my expression looked. It wasn't exactly me. It was older, sadder, and eyes wider, staring with a weight I did not remember having. A shiver ran down my spine as I picked one of the bills up again. My fingers trembled, tracing the lines of my face, as though hoping the tactile sensation might confirm it was just paper. And yet, I could feel something beneath the surface, a strange warmth, almost like the skin I was used to touching, soft and alive beneath the coarse texture of the paper. I tried to drop it, but the note seemed to cling to me, heavy, almost sentient. I glanced around, hoping someone would walk by, someone to tell me I was imagining it. But the street was empty, wet and glimmering under the muted street lamps. Cafe shutters reflected faint streaks of light, and the electronics store window, cracked and dusty, offered only a dark, silent reflection of the world outside. And in it, for a split second, I thought I saw movement, not from me, not from the bills, but something shifting behind the glass, a shadow that mimicked my posture too perfectly. I took a step back, and a gust of wind, or was it a whisper, slid across my ear, soft and almost imperceptible, like someone speaking my name from far away. My pulse quickened. I dropped the bills again, this time stepping back entirely, almost tripping on the wet curb. The ATM hummed faintly, almost satisfied, and then, without warning, produced another note, perfectly balanced on the edge of the slot. I bent down, unable to resist, and saw again that same face, etched in detail I had never seen before. Eyes that seemed to follow me as I moved, lips slightly parted in a frozen, silent gasp. I ran. I did not care where, I did not care. Why, rain soaked through my coat, puddles splashing against my shoes as I stumbled down the empty streets. But even as I ran, I could feel them, hundreds of tiny weights in my pockets, every note pressing against me with a strange urgency. I dared not look, not at my reflection, not at the windows, not at the street lamps. But I could hear them, the soft rustling of paper, whispering, a chorus of my own voice murmuring in ways I could not understand, repeating words I had never said. By the time I reached home, drenched and shivering, the stack of notes had multiplied in my hands and pockets. I tried to throw them into the trash, into the toilet, even into the rain outside, but no matter where they went, more appeared, pressing against my skin, warm and unyielding, until I could feel nothing else. The room seemed to shrink around me, the walls pressing closer, and shadows pulled in corners where light should have been. And in every reflection, in every darkened surface, I could see the same face, staring back, not quite mine, but unmistakably me, older, more tired, eyes hollow yet unblinking, following every movement I made. Days passed. I avoided the streets where ATMs stood, avoided the banks, avoided any sign of commerce or machines. But the bills followed me. They were everywhere, on the floor when I woke, in my coat pockets when I hadn't touched them, on the kitchen counter, stacked neatly, as though placed there by an unseen hand. Sometimes I would wake in the middle of the night and hear the soft flapping of paper against walls, the faintest rustle moving from room to room, carrying with it that silent, impossible gaze. I tried to photograph them, to show someone, anyone, but every image on my phone displayed only blank paper. Even scanning, even digital capture, failed. It was as if reality itself refused to acknowledge the bill's existence, except to me. I began to notice other details, subtle and disturbing, shadows that moved independently of the furniture, reflections in puddles outside that showed more than the street, and the faintest whisper of a voice, echoing through hallways, calling my name over and over in tones I did not recognize but instinctively feared. And yet, there was a pull I could not resist. I would sometimes pick up a note, tracing the printed lines of my face, feeling that impossible warmth, that strange weight. And in those moments, I understood, in a way that terrified me, that they were not just copies, they were warnings, or perhaps invitations. There was a pattern, a rhythm, a life to their existence that I could sense but never comprehend fully. Even now, months later, I still wake to find them stacked around the apartment, their eyes following, their faces twisted slightly in ways I cannot explain. I avoid mirrors when I can, yet the faint reflection of my own face sometimes seems to lag, to blink late, to smile with knowledge I do not possess. And every time I pass an ATM, I feel it before I even see it, the cold, mechanical pull, the soft hum of impossible printing, as if the world is quietly, inexorably trying to give me more of myself than I am ready to carry. I have stopped using money. I avoid banks. I rarely leave the apartment. Yet I know, deep down, that it is not about the currency, not about the bills themselves. It is about recognition. They are waiting for me, these duplicates, these impossible tokens of my existence, patient, watching, always replicating. And I fear that one day, there will be no room left for anything else in the world but the relentless multiplication of my own face, staring back at me endlessly, until I cannot distinguish where I end and they begin. Sometimes, when the rain falls and the city is quiet, I think I can hear the soft flapping of paper outside, a distant hum of machines working tirelessly somewhere, producing more, always more, and I wonder if they are waiting, or if they are already here. I had always loved taking photographs of the city skyline at night. There was something comforting in the way the buildings glimmered like distant stars, the way the lights reflected off the wet streets after rain. That evening the air was thick, with humidity, the kind that made the skin on your arms tingle and the hair at the back of your neck stand up ever so slightly. I climbed to the old observation deck on the tallest building I could find, the one that had long since stopped being maintained properly. The metal stairs creaked under my boots, and the wind carried a faint metallic tang that reminded me of forgotten places. I set up my camera, adjusting the lens to capture the whole panorama. The city sprawled below me, a labyrinth of glimmering lines and flickering windows. There was a stillness in the air, broken only by the occasional distant siren or the soft hum of electricity from the streetlights. I framed the shot, holding the camera steady against the tremor in my hands. And then, I felt it, a subtle pressure, the awareness of someone just out of the corner of my eye. I turned quickly, but the observation deck was empty, save for the rusted railings and the discarded cigarette butts left by someone who had passed long ago. Shaking my head, I told myself it was the wind, or the way shadows played tricks on me. I looked through the camera again, trying to focus entirely on the city. The shutter clicked, and I glanced at the preview screen, expecting to see nothing unusual. But there, in the reflection of the glass, standing just behind me, was a figure. It was faint, blurred by the low light, almost like a smudge in the corner of the frame. I spun around, heart hammering, but the deck remained empty. No one was there. Just the wind, the flickering lights, and the distant drone of the city below. I rationalized it as a trick of the camera, a lens flare, or maybe a shadow cast by one of the old structural beams. I took another photo, careful this time, turning the camera slightly to avoid reflections. When I checked the image, the figure was closer, sharper than before, standing just behind me now, in a position I had not expected it to occupy. The faint outline of a face, featureless yet unmistakably human, stared directly into the lens. I spun around again, my breath rising in quick, shallow bursts. Empty. Nothing but the dark metal stairs and the wind. A shiver ran down my spine, and I realized I had not been alone. Not physically, perhaps, but something else had been there with me, moving with a silent patience just out of reach. I tried to convince myself I had imagined it, that my tired mind was projecting loneliness onto the empty space. I tried to focus on the camera again, but every time I raised it, the feeling grew stronger, the sense of being watched, followed, never quite alone. I took another photo, this time almost automatically, hands trembling. When I looked at it, the figure had shifted again, its outline more defined. Its gaze fixed on the camera, as though it had known all along that I would capture it. The hair was long and dark, obscuring features, but the presence was undeniably there. I stepped back, my boots scraping against the rusted metal, and the hairs on my arms stood straight. I felt the pressure behind me again, this time stronger, a heat that was not my own pressing into my back. The wind carried faint whispers, almost imperceptible, like someone speaking words I could not understand, yet somehow I recognized them. They were my own thoughts, mirrored back at me in a cadence that made my stomach knot. I tried to leave, moving toward the stairs, but the deck seemed longer than it should have been, twisted in ways I had never noticed. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the railings, bending around corners where no light should reach. I took one last photo, unable to resist, a mixture of fear and compulsion driving me. The image was horrifying. The figure was right behind me now, impossibly close, almost filling the frame. Its face was blurred, but I could feel its eyes, unblinking and patient, piercing through me. The whispering grew louder, though no one was there. The wind howled, as if in protest, carrying faint echoes of footsteps that did not exist, and I stumbled, fumbling for the railing. When I finally reached the top of the stairs and turned to descend, the figure was gone. The deck was empty, the city below calm, the lights twinkling innocently as if nothing had happened. My heart continued to race, each breath sharp in my chest. But I knew it had been real. The camera confirmed image a record of a presence that should not have existed. Moving closer each time, patient, silent, and observant. I left the building quickly, my boots slapping wet pavement, trying to convince myself that the night, the shadows, and the rain had played tricks. But even now, when I review those photos on my computer, I can see it. Always there, just behind me, in every shot I took that night. And sometimes, late at night, when the city is quiet, and I'm alone in my apartment, I feel it again, the subtle pressure behind me, the soft, imperceptible whispers, and the knowledge that it is still watching, waiting, patient and unrelenting. No one else believes me. I've shown the photos, tried to explain what I felt, but the camera seems like an ordinary lens to everyone else. The figure only appears in my perspective, always just behind me, always silent, always patient. And I've realized something I cannot shake. It is not just in the photos. It is everywhere I am, always behind me, always waiting, and every time I reach for my camera, it moves closer. I had always been drawn to rooftops, not in a reckless, thrill-seeking way, but in a quiet fascination with the city from above. The way the streets seemed smaller, the lights softer, and the world more distant. That evening, rain fell in long, steady sheets, painting the city in shades of gray and silver. The air smelled of wet concrete and iron, carrying a strange, sharp tang that made my lungs feel heavy. I had come to the tallest building I could find, one of the few still open to visitors, its elevators old and creaking. I stepped onto the rooftop and was immediately greeted by the hush of the city. The rain masked almost everything: the distant sirens, the occasional honk, the chatter of people far below. But here, on the edge of the building, the silence was absolute, except for the soft, rhythmic patter of water on concrete. I leaned on the rail, taking in the panorama. The city stretched endlessly in every direction, a shimmering web of lights reflected in puddles forming along the roof. My hands were slick with rain as I held onto the edge, savoring the calm, the solitude. Then I saw her. She was on the opposite side of the rooftop, standing near the edge. At first, I thought she was another visitor, perhaps seeking the same quiet escape. She raised a hand, waving slowly, deliberately, and I hesitated before returning the gesture. There was something unnerving about her movement, the way her body seemed too still for the rain to bend her hair, too precise, too calm. Yet, despite that, her presence felt oddly familiar, as though I had known her for years without ever having met. Before I could call out, she stepped off the edge. My heart stopped. I expected to hear the thump of impact, the splash of water below, anything, but there was nothing. She did not fall. She did not even twitch. She simply hovered, mid-air, body suspended as though gravity had lost its hold. The rain traced her outline, dripping past her feet without disturbance. My stomach twisted with disbelief, and I stumbled backward, gripping the railing. I blinked, certain my mind was playing tricks, that exhaustion or the monotony of the rain had conjured some impossible image. But she waved again, slowly, her smile calm, almost gentle. It wasn't menacing, it was serene, but every instinct in me screamed that something was profoundly wrong. I wanted to look away, to close my eyes, but my body betrayed me, frozen, drawn to her hovering figure, unable to tear myself from the impossible sight. The wind rose, a whispering rush that made the puddles on the roof ripple and the air cold against my soaked skin. I could see the city lights below, hazy and distant, and yet the sound seemed to fade with every heartbeat. The only thing I could hear clearly was the faint, soft rustle of her clothes as if she were moving through water, though the rain fell steadily around her. I tried to speak, to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. And then she blinked, or I thought she blinked. Her eyes were impossibly calm, impossibly knowing, and I felt, in a way that made my blood chill, that she could see through me, into every corner of my mind. The rain poured harder, masking sounds, yet I could swear I heard a soft exhale, almost a whisper of my name, carried in the wet wind. She remained suspended for what felt like hours, though the clock on the nearby building told me it had been no more than minutes. I wanted to step closer, to reach out, but a wave of dread pinned me in place. Her hand stayed raised, fingers curling and uncurling in a slow, deliberate rhythm, and I realized I could not look away without feeling some profound absence. as if tearing my gaze would make the world itself shift. And then, just as suddenly as she appeared, she was gone. The space where she had hovered was empty, the rain falling uninterrupted, no splash, no shadow, no sign of impact. My heart hammered, my breath came in ragged gasps, and I felt a vertigo that made my knees weak. I looked around, half expecting to see her on some hidden ledge, some secret balcony, but the rooftop was as barren as it had been when I arrived. Only the rain remained, a constant, unyielding wash of silver light and sound. I stumbled down the stairs, drenched and shaking, feeling the hollow echo of the impossible moments linger with every step. The corridors of the building seemed longer, the lights dimmer, shadows stretching unnaturally along the walls. When I reached the lobby, I dared to glance out the glass doors at the street below. The city pulsed with its usual rhythm, indifferent to the events above, yet I felt a lingering presence and awareness that something had left a trace I could not see. At home, I tried to convince myself it had been a hallucination, a trick of light and rain, exhaustion and imagination playing cruel games. Yet, later that night, as I lay in bed, I felt it again. A gentle pressure against the ceiling, the faintest hint of movement above me, like the soft brush of a hand in the air, almost imperceptible. And I could not shake the memory of her calm, unblinking eyes, her suspended form hovering in a world that should not have allowed it, waving slowly, patiently, at someone who could not reach her. I have not returned to rooftops since. I avoid heights, avoid rain-heavy evenings, and yet I cannot escape the memory. Sometimes, when the wind howls and the city grows quiet, I feel her there again, somewhere above, waiting and watching, waving, suspended in the impossible space between reality and whatever else it is that defies it. And I wonder, not without fear, if one day I will see her again, whether I will be the one left standing, or the one who never falls. I had always liked walking through the city at night, especially when the streets were quiet and the rain left a slick, reflective sheen on the asphalt. That evening, I had no destination, just a vague desire to wander, to feel the wet pavement. Under my shoes, the soft hum of neon signs bouncing off puddles. The air smelled of ozone and wet concrete, and the occasional breeze carried faint scents of food from late-night diners. Streetlights flickered in the drizzle, creating long, shifting shadows that seemed to crawl across the sidewalks, and I felt a strange sense of calm in the solitude. I approached a familiar intersection, one I had crossed countless times. The traffic lights glowed a muted red, and the crosswalk signals were the usual stark white figures walking man, hand raised, telling pedestrians when to go. I paused on the curb, my coat soaked, my umbrella useless against the sideways rain. The city was quiet, almost too quiet. Even the distant cars seemed subdued, their engines muffled by the wet night. Then I noticed something strange. The crosswalk signal in front of me, the one I had seen 100 times, flickered. Not in the normal way of old electronics, but with a deliberate, almost impatient rhythm. And then the symbol changed. Not the usual walk, not the flashing "don't walk," but a word I did not expect: run. I blinked, certain my eyes were playing tricks that the harsh neon reflected strangely against the rain. But it stayed, glowing, insistent. Run. The letters were jagged, uneven, as if they had been carved into the screen by some unseen hand. My heart skipped a beat, a low anxiety stirring in my chest. I glanced at the street, half expecting cars to be lined up, the usual traffic patterns intact, but everything seemed normal to normal. The lights, the puddles, the empty streets, they all looked exactly as they should. I hesitated. Something about the word felt like a warning. Instinctively, I stepped back from the curb. The rain spattered against my face, the wind tugging at my jacket, and I realized I was holding my breath. A soft, almost imperceptible hum began to rise from the street itself, low enough that I felt it more in my chest than in my ears. And then I noticed it. The shadows along the sidewalks weren't behaving the way shadows should. They shifted, independently, stretching toward me, reaching just beyond the edges of the streetlights, twitching in impossible ways. The crosswalk signal changed again. Run. It flashed 3 times in quick succession, urgent now, almost desperate. My legs stiffened, and I realized I had been frozen, unable to move. I wanted to look away, to escape the intersection entirely, but something compelled me to stay, to watch. The wet pavement began to shimmer in the streetlights, reflecting the word back at me, over and over. Run, run, run. I noticed figures at the far end of the street. They were indistinct at first, just shadows blurred in the rain, but they were moving toward the intersection. Not walking, not running, but gliding. Their movements were synchronized, too smooth, too deliberate. Their heads tilting at impossible angles, their limbs bending unnaturally. Each step or lack of steps seemed to stretch time itself, dragging the seconds into long, uneasy moments. The first figure stopped at the edge of the street, staring at me with something I could not quite name. Its face was obscured, featureless. In the dim light, yet I felt its gaze like a weight pressing against my chest. The crosswalk light flashed again. Run. I wanted to step back, to flee, but my feet were rooted to the wet pavement. Panic swelled, tight and unrelenting, a cold knot twisting in my stomach. The air itself seemed to thrum with expectation, waiting for me to act. Then, a subtle shift in the wind, a whisper carried in the rain, barely audible. Run. It wasn't the crosswalk anymore. It was something else, a voice not quite human, echoing from everywhere and nowhere. The other figures began moving forward, gliding over the street with a silence that made my ears ring. The world seemed to slow, each droplet of rain suspended in mid-air, each reflection in the puddles trembling like liquid glass. I turned on instinct and ran not across the crosswalk, not even thinking of safety but down the street, letting the cold rain sting my face, letting my coat whip behind me. Every step echoed unnaturally, reverberating through the empty city. And as I ran, I could feel them behind me, their presence brushing against the edge of my awareness, moving impossibly fast, always just out of sight. I stumbled into a narrow alley, the neon lights fading behind me. The hum of the streetlights, the quiet whisper of the crosswalk signal, all of it receded, replaced by the soft slap of my own wet shoes and the distant, distorted echo of run, run, run. I slowed, trying to catch my breath, looking back over my shoulder. The street was empty again, normal again, as if the figures had never existed. The crosswalk signal now simply blinked its usual walking man, indifferent, mundane. Even now, I cannot walk past that intersection without feeling the pressure in my chest, the quiet insistence at the back of my mind. Sometimes, when I cross in the dead of night, I swear I can see the faint glow of the word flashing, just for a moment, before the light flickers back to normal. And every time I see it, I feel the same compulsion, the same terror, as if the city itself is warning me, whispering, always whispering, run.